Allie, and I want to show you today how to work with fun vintage buttons and create them into a pendant. Buttons really vary in size and shape, and I'm going to show you not only how to do the buttons, but how to do a fun bail as well too, using a new stitch that you might not have checked out before. If you need any materials, want to check out our vintage buttons, go below the video in the description, and you can click links there to get back to our website. Gather up your materials, 11s and 8/0 seed beads, and let's get started. All right, so we are talking buttons. And when we're talking buttons, we're talking how to make a button into a pendant. There are so many vintage, beautiful, beautiful buttons floating around. You probably have a tin or a box of them somewhere. And it can be hard to go in and to know how to bezel a button because they have different heights and thicknesses. They're different sizes. Some are a little bit thinner, some are a little bit thicker. Sometimes that shank goes out really far. You don't want it to poke in your neck. So we're going to show some problem solving and how to work and to create a button working with it to be a pendant. I'm also going to do the bail and show you how to do that nice bail. So watch to the end. What we're going to be doing is using Hubble Stitch. This is a lovely stitch created by Melanie De Miguel, and we are going to be using a certain number of Hubble units per button. 18 millimeter, 11, 24, which is this one here. It's going to be about 13 units. As you get bigger, 28, 14 units. Every 4 millimeters you go up, you're going to basically add another unit when you're working with it. Now, this varies because you might have a button that's a little bit off. So number one, you'll want to grab a ruler and you'll get about a baseline and then you'll measure as you go. I'm using this beautiful blue AB shimmer one here. It's about 18 millimeters, so I know I have about 11 units. We have tons and tons of these vintage buttons, and it's fun to see kind of what you can create. We're going to be using 11/0 seed beads and a couple 8/0s to get started. And it's going to be the same process no matter what size. You're just counting and changing the amount of the original Hubble units. As it gets bigger, you may need to do more units as we build up. But right now we're going to do how we get the back basically started. We're going to do the Hubble units and then we're going to combine them and we're going to see how it sits on the shank itself. Usually by the time you do a couple units, even if you need to build one more up, that's easy. So to start out, we're going to do some Hubble stitch. So to begin our Hubble stitch, we are using again 11s and 8s. I have on my thread and needle size 8 dragon thread in the white color and about 4 feet of that. I'm letting it drop down to the base of my thread, and then I'm going to add a third bead, which is my 8/0, which is going to be my base bead. I'm going to go back up through bead number 1 toward bead number 2, and that's going to create almost like a herringbone stitch, if you're familiar with that, where our 11/0s kind of sit fanned out in a V shape towards the top, the 8/0s along the bottom. The reason I'm using the 8/0 is because it's a little bit bigger to go around that shank, that button shank in the back. From here, I'm going to add one more bead. Each Hubble unit consists of 4 beads. So I'm adding one more bead. I'm coming out of bead number 1. I add a bead and I'm going down bead number 2. This is one Hubble unit. So he uses 4 beads like right angle weave, but it looks more like a herringbone stitch and they sit disconnected. So we're going to do our next unit, 1, 2 11/0s, followed by 1 8/0. We let it guide down next to the beads that we just put on. And then you're going to sew back up through bead number 1 and out. So you're sewing through bead number 1 toward bead number 2. Pushing that all down next to the last unit. See how they're pretty much just disconnected. They're just hanging there by a thread. That's normal. We're going to add one more 11/0 as our 4th bead to our unit. Coming out of bead number 1, and we sew down bead number 2. I always like to call these, as I'm making them, these look like foosball players that kind of are just on a line and we can spin and we can move all different ways. What will happen while you're doing this is it will move while you're working on this first row in all different ways. So don't worry if it's kind of flipping and flopping, that's okay. 3 beads go on, 2 11s, 1 8. So back through bead number 1 toward bead number 2 and out. Pull that thread and needle tight. Push it down next to the project. You'll notice I'm pulling here and not at my needle. That's going to prevent your thread from fraying. Between beads 1 and 2, add bead number 4. That is 3 units, and I've got 7 or 8 more rather to go to get to 11 to get ready to go around my button. Once you have your Hubble units in place here, and I have a total of my 11 units on, again, those foosball players, sometimes the bottom wants to go to the top and vice versa, we'll get it sorted out. So 11 units is what I'm going to use for this 18 millimeter sized button with that shank. I'm coming out of the bottom of bead 2 from the last Hubble unit, and what I'm going to do is to go back to the first Hubble unit. I'm going to go into bead number 1, right at that start thread of that first Hubble unit, pretending like I don't even have the beads there. We're almost just basically starting another Hubble unit. Skip over bead number 4 and go through bead number 2. That really kind of locks it in place. And then you're going to come out through the bottom through bead number 3. So now you can see kind of you have a messy circle. What we're going to do is we are going to flip it so that all of the foosball players' pants are down towards the interior. So all those 8s are towards the interior. What this is doing is forming a nice little nest to hold in that button when you're looking at the shank. If you don't have a button with a shank and it just has holes, you probably can do one more unit because you don't have that back that you're worrying about. What we're going to do now is go in and we are going to add 1 11-0 between each one of our bottom beads from our Hubble stitch. So I'm coming out of an 8, I add an 11 onto my needle, and then I go in to the next 8. Add an 11 on, and I sew into the next 8. So I'm just picking up all of those 8-0 seed beads. Get our starter thread out of the way here. Tuck to the bottom. Don't want to sew through that. And you're just repeating this the whole way along the line. What this is going to do is going to get ready for us to do another Hubble unit or netting. Kind of talk you through both as you go in and basically problem solve as you're working with a button, because they're all so lovely and different. So here you can see it's starting to lay a little nicer where I've gone through and added the seed beads between each, that those are all going towards that center. That's going to create that back here that sits again a little bit higher for you to have that shank in. Going around here, just going to continue adding in 1 11-0 between each one of my 8s, forcing that to behave and sit correctly. And if you need to, again, if it's towards the outer edge, you just kind of fold it towards the middle to get to the interior. And see how that's forming a nice loop and circle. I have one more. Once you add your last one, you're going to go back through that same 8-0, and I sew over just a little couple units and come out one of the 8-0s on the opposite side. What that does is really close up that loop and see how it's sitting already kind of in that nice bezel shape. This also, just to let you know, 11 is the count for a 14 millimeter Rivoli if you want to drop that in. So see how we're not really on the outside. It's pretty much going to sit almost even with our button here, because our goal is that these beads sit up, and when you turn it to the side, they almost work flat and flush with that bead cap, or with that bead shank. What we're going to do now is a second Hubble unit. And the second Hubble unit, we're coming out of one of our 8-0s. We're going to sew into bead number 1 from that Hubble unit. So the 11-0 right after that 8, or sitting right on top. And then we're also going to sew through bead number 4, which is always going to be the points of those Hubble units. From here, we're going to start our next Hubble units. So our next Hubble units, we're going to increase in size slightly. So we are going to use the 6s as beads 1 and 2. Bead 3 is already there. Bead 3 is our 11-0 seed bead that we're coming out of. Sewing through. That sits up, here I'll turn it this way so you can kind of see. That sits up bead number 1 and number 2. Going to the sides, this time remember it's the 8-0. I'm going to go back through bead number 1. We're going to add an 11-0, and we're going to sew down through the 8-0 seed bead. number 2. Now, what do we do next? 1 and 2 of our 8 O's go on because that's our next Hubble unit, beads 1 and 2. We sew back through bead number 3 toward the last Hubble unit. Bead number 3 is the top of the unit below it. So you're grabbing onto the top of that bead. I add 2 beads. I sew back toward the unit I just finished. I go through bead number 1. I give a nice tight pull. I add an 11O and I sew down through bead number 2. I'll do that one more time for you. You're adding 1 and 2 new 8 O's. You're sewing through that point or that 4th bead from the Hubble unit below toward the last Hubble unit you just finished. So it almost feels like you're sewing backwards. That lays those 8 O's. Sew up through the first 8 O toward the second 8. That opens those up. And we're switching back to an 11O for bead number 4 and down bead number 2. And that's it. We're going to continue the whole way around the 11 units, adding in 11 more units sitting stacked on top, with beads 1 and 2 being the 8, bead 3 being the point from the unit below, and bead 4 being another 11O seed bead added. When you finish the 11th unit here, we need to connect unit number 11 to unit number 1, just like we did to start that beginning circle. To connect them, what we are going to do is, just like we did with the beginning circle, we're going to pretty much ignore the fact that we have the beads already on there and pretend these are new beads. Adding bead number 1, which would be that first 8 O, so we're sewing coming out of unit 12 or 11, sorry, going through bead number 1, going through bead number 2, going through bead number 3, which again is that bottom 11 that we're sharing. This time, because we're going to be building up rather than connecting the base, we're going back through bead number 1, again, just like if we were building a new unit, and out through bead number 4. And there we go. So now you can see you almost have that little bowl or that little cup. So our button's going to sit right nice and in the interior there. If you get done and your button is sitting a little bit funky, you can always use 11 O's at the base if you want. I like the 8 O's again because it sits up a little bit. Now you can see we have a nice base for our button to sit inside. You can do one more Hubble unit, which is what we're going to do. If your button is really, really, really thick and you're like, oh man, this is crazy thick or crazy high that you need to do, you can do another second unit with the same size beads. It's up to you. What we're going to do is switch it up just slightly. So we're coming out of that Hubble. I'm just kind of pressing the bead there so you can see it a little bit better. We're coming out of that Hubble through bead number 3, basically, of the next unit. We're going to use 1 and 2 11 O's. So back through bead number 3, because remember, we're always going in reverse when we add the extra units. We're going to go up through bead number 1, and bead number 4 that we add is going to be an 11O seed bead. And that gets us the units closer here. Now it's going to be a stretch from one to the other. So we are going to add in an extra bead. I know, you're like, what are you doing here? We're adding in an extra bead. So what that extra bead is going to do is allow us basically to have the space from one to the other. So we're switching now, and we're going to add an 8O seed bead. In my sample piece here, if you want to, I added just some netting because it was a really thin button. So I just went in and I added a netting right away of 2 seed beads, 1 15O, 2 seed beads. I'm going to do on this one more row of herringbone. 1 8O gets added on after I finish that herringbone unit. We're going to pretend that that bead's not even there. Next, I'm starting my next unit. So I'm going in and I use 2 11 O's. I sew back through the 4th bead from the unit below there, catching on to it. That 8O seed bead just kind of hangs out there in the middle. And I'm going back up through bead number 1, that 11O that I added, adding an 11O on the top, and coming down through the next bead. I'm going to take my button out, but I just wanted to show you kind of what that looks like and how that's going to fit around them. So once again, in between the units, I'm adding 1 8O, letting it chill and hang out. From here, 1 and 2 11s, back through the 4th bead, or the bead that sits at the top of the Hubble unit below, go back through bead number 1 toward bead number 2. It's a little awkward at first not to get that 8-0 connected into the thread. Add one more 11 and on to the next. So that's it. So you're going to do a whole unit row around where you're doing the same thing, adding an 8-0 seed bead, 2 11s after. The 8-0 is not part of the Hubble stitch, it's just there. Sewing back through bead number 1. And you'll notice it'll start to kind of cave in a little bit. Add an 11, because we're making basically the ridge to our bowl. And continue on with your units. So when you get done with the end of your row, you're just going to continue into that interior here. And again, connection. Acting like it's not even there. Sew through bead number 1. Sew through bead number 2, not bead number 4, which is right there at the top. That pulls it nice and tight in. Sew through the base bead, which is the 11-0 from the row below it. Back up through bead number 1, and then out through bead number 4 of this first unit. Now, one thing I did not articulate well at the beginning of the video, and I apologize, is you may be wondering why Hubble Stitch. So I'm using Hubble Stitch because it is a super forgiving stitch. You have that extra little space in there where you have the thread. It kind of stretches and goes along with it. So it's not like a Rivoli with a delicate bezel where you have to fit it exactly. So I find this to be really easy to use to go around anything where you're not exactly sure how you're working with it. Also, that top bead on the Hubble Stitch unit is perfect to go in and to create any sort of fringe, or sorry, any sort of netting to go in and wrap around. So it kind of becomes problem solving towards the end of the button, and you think, how am I going to cinch this in and bring it together? Hubble Stitch has that beautiful top where you have one bead right at the top ready to go to bring it together. Whether or not you say, hey, it's still sitting a little high, let me do some netting. Netting refers to just basically creating beads and then capturing and connecting them. So along this one here, 1, 2, 11s, 1, 15, 1, 2, 11s were captured onto my thread, and then I sewed through the next upper bead here and then pulled that even more together. What we're going to do is, once again, kind of pull this together around the button, and we are going to go ahead and use an 11-0 seed bead, pulling that in toward the middle nice and tight. Now, I'm doing this live, or as I'm doing it, because I want to show sometimes you need to undo this last row because it's just not sitting and cooperating correctly, and you need to switch it to a different bead, or you see too much thread. So play around with me as you're going into this last row of your beads, connecting the Hubble stitch. We're creating a netting if your bead sits high. And if this doesn't work, we go in and we say, okay, let's add 2 beads. Or maybe you switch your 11-0 to an 8-0. This really is, when you're working with a button, don't get frustrated. You are problem solving. So I'm going around all of the beads number 4s right now, seeing how 1 11-0 sits between all of them, how much thread I see, because the ridge and the cut of the button can be totally different from one to the other. So if you have an 18mm, its profile might sit way higher. To see exactly how it fits, I'm going back through some of those 11s that I just added right there, as well as the 11s that I was catching on to. And now here's time for the magic. You give a nice tight pull and see how it responds. I push those other beads out towards the exterior. I look at it and I say, okay, how much extra space am I seeing? How is it fitting along my button? Fits well there along the edge, but I still see a lot of space here on the interior. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my needle and thread off. I'm going to pull out that last row, and I'm going to switch from 1 bead to 2 beads. Sometimes it's really great to see this problem solving as you're working with it because, again, it can be unpredictable when bezeling. And that's, again, why I love the Hubble Stitch, because it's super forgiving that you can play around with it. So I'm going to go ahead in and put 2 of my seed beads between each of that fourth bead of my last Hubble stitch. Now that I've got those 2 beads in between, it sits so much nicer. You did that nice pull. I always feel like I'm doing magic when I do that final pull of my thread. And see how the button just sits ever so nicely right in the interior. And the 8 O's along the side actually add a little bit of flair to it that I like. Pulls a little bit of that blue color. All right, so now that I have that center fit, I want you to make sure that you're taking your thread and needle back through all of those beads right at the center one more time. Anytime you have a Rivoli or anything that you're capturing basically or putting that it's got to be held in, it doesn't have a hole, nothing sewed through it. You always want to make sure to do 2 threads. It also makes the line a lot nicer. What happens if you need it to be just a tiny bit tighter? You can go through the 2 seed beads that you just added, skip over the 11O and add a 15O in between. That's another version. And now what we're going to do is we're going to work our way out towards the exterior, and we are going to get in there a nice bail. The bail we're going to be doing is a right angle weave bail. So we're switching from Hubble stitch to right angle weave. And I'm going to sew towards the exterior, now coming out through one of those interior 4th beads. I'm going to sew back, which would be through bead number 2. I'm going to come out then bead number 3, which would be one of those connector beads right there at the top. From here, we're going to start our bail. So our bail is going to sit where we start 1 unit of Hubble and then we go right into right angle weave. So 1, 2 beads. I'm going to go back into that same bead, which is going to be the 3rd bottom Hubble bead there. And then going up through bead number 1, I am going to add bead number 4. I'm going to reinforce this going back down through bead number 2, back through bead number 3, back up through bead number 1, and out bead number 4. As I come out bead number 4, this is when we switch from our Hubble stitch to our right angle weave. And if you've never done right angle weave before, it's simple. 1, 2, 3 beads go on. I'm coming out of that top bead there on my Hubble. I'm going to sew in through the opposite direction. I'm going to go up through the next bead, and I'm going to go out, so I'm out the top. Again, 1, 2, 3 beads go on. This time my thread's coming out the top of that bead. I'm going to go into the bottom. I'm going to go through whichever bead lies on the side, whether or not I'm on the left or the right. And then I'm going to come out through the bead that sits at the top of the bail. I want you to do this, let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we're going to do this 3 more times to get a decent size bail. So I did my 6th unit of right angle weave here, and I'm going to connect to the back. So remember, we have 2 Hubble units that sit right on top of one another. We're coming out of Hubble unit number 2 in our 2nd row. We're going to go back into Hubble unit number 1. And we're going to go into bead number 4 of that first Hubble unit. What that does, and my thread is coming out the left side there of that top bead, I'm going to go into the left side and to the right. And then I'm going to sew back through that last bead of the last right angle weave unit that I did. So we're just circling around and connecting there. I'm going to connect there one more time, going back through, reinforcing. And now we're going to go up and down. So right angle weave, we have beads that are sitting on the right side and beads that are sitting on the left side with their holes going vertical. Horizontal beads are the ones that are as we build the bail up. We're going to go through the first bead on that left-hand side. We're going to add an 11O on, and we're going to go through the next bead on the left-hand side. Add an 11O in, go through the next bead. So we're capturing and connecting all 6 of these right angle weave units to make this nice pretty bail. When we get back towards the starter side, we started out with Hubble stitch, and because we did that, we get almost a nice V-shape bail. because we're not going to be adding one on there. So here we are, basically back at the start. We're going to add one bead on. We're going to go back into that Hubble unit on the right-hand side. We're going to go through that base 11-0 of that Hubble unit. It's getting a little tight. You might need to do a little wiggle or switch to a thinner needle so you don't break that bead. Now what we're going to do is go up through bead number 1 of the Hubble stitch. And then we're going to connect the other side of our bail. So we're going to go up and just connect right along the edge. And I like the way that this bail looks at the top of a pendant. You can use it on any because, again, it almost looks like that triangle pinch bail look, if you're familiar with those. I'm just going right down through that extra side of my right angle weave stitch. Do you have to do this? No, the right angle weave stitch, or you can just do your Hubble stitch over and over again. When I get to the back here, I use my last bead, go into the unit, reinforce one more time along the back here. So into the base, which is going to be that original Hubble unit. So into that Hubble stitch and right down to that starter row. As I go to the starter row here, I'm sewing right back along, right till we get to the thread end. Grab those 2 thread ends, tie them into a nice knot along the back of the button so you'll never see it. Grab your thread zap or your thread burner, burn off those thread edges, burn them flat down towards your project. And when you burn those flat down towards your project, then you don't see them at all. And see how nice that bail is, just going right into that loop. By the time you put on a cord or something that's going through it, you even see it nicer and really, really finished and jeweled up. So the fun thing with buttons are they make beautiful pendants. It is really problem solving when it comes to working with these, depending on how many units you start with, what the pattern is, how the netting goes. So again, here's the 11 units, 13 units, 14 units approximately for the different ways that you can do a bezel. I could go in here, add some crystals, add some bling, make it gorgeous, but I just want you to have those fundamentals of how you're going in, starting with that Hubble stitch, which is going to pull back towards that shank there, and continuing on with the design. Thanks so much for joining me in creating these bezeled buttons to create pendants. You can also do this with sea glass. You can do it with found objects as you're hiking or making memorabilia or seashells. It's really great to use that Hubble stitch as the base and kind of problem solve as you go, looking at the depth of the piece and how much you want to come around it. Hopefully you loved the bail as well too. And if you want to see more videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. As always, you can join our Facebook group for beading and jewelry making and join in this amazing Potomac Beads community. Thanks so much for watching, Potomac Beaders, and stay tuned for more inspirational designs.